When Tomas stopped at the head of Block 19, he sat on the ATV's rear rack and cleaned one boot with a screwdriver. The soil in the South Almonds had dried to a fine pale dust by midnight, but the block he'd just come through had held a little water around the tree berms, and a seam of dark mud was packed into the lugs of his right boot. If he left it there, the next row would feel wrong. All night he judged the ground with his feet before he bent to look at anything. Hard pan near the surface. Fresh wash from a leak. A place where a microsprinkler had been throwing against a trunk because somebody clipped the stake with a mower. Wet soil carried differently than dry soil. It lifted at the heel. He got the mud out, dropped it beside the rear tire, and listened. The set was already on in the west half. He could hear the little steady ticks of the microsprinklers under the trees, thousands of them too small to count, each one throwing a flat low fan over the weeded strip. Farther off, at the head of the block, a pressure regulator was making its dry throat sound. The main line came up from the pump station by the reservoir, split to submains, and each submain fed a set of electric valves that the scheduler opened and closed without asking anybody. Soil probes sat in selected rows with their wires in gray conduit. A weather station by the shop fed evapotranspiration numbers into the same system. The co-op ran water mostly at night when it could, to save some of it from the sun and to keep the reservoir drawdown smooth before morning demand picked up everywhere else. Tomas knew the nouns because he had been here 3 seasons, and because names made it easier to tell somebody what had broken. He was not the person who decided when Block 19 ran or for how long. He checked what the system could not feel with wires in the ground. Split tubing, chewed laterals, missing sprinkler heads, clogged nozzles, a valve box filling with ants, a leak running down row under the top inch of dirt before it showed itself. He turned off the ATV light and walked in. The orchard after midnight had its own scale. In the day the rows looked finite. At night they kept going. The trees were just past full leaf now, enough canopy to take the moonlight and hold it in broken strips over the middles. The microsprinklers caught his lamp now and then and threw it back in a fast white stitch. Water tapped plastic, leaves, the hammered metal tags on the risers. Every so often a night wind moved through the tops and the whole block answered once and settled. He walked one row with the lamp down, then the next without it, listening for the change that meant a blocked nozzle or a head gone missing. A good microsprinkler had a thin, hard whisper. A damaged one chattered or spat. A loose-fitting hissed low to the ground. Sometimes the fastest way to find a bad line was to stop moving and let the orchard tell on itself. At row 88 he stopped. He had not meant to count that far. He always counted that far. The ground was darker between trees here than it should have been for this part of the set. Not soupy, not leak dark, just a little ahead of the rest of the block, as if this strip had been running longer and had not bothered to say so. He stepped off the berm into the wetted band and felt the soil give under his right foot. Tomas stood still until his eyes adjusted around the lamp beam. No pooling, no sheen. The sprinkler at the nearest tree was turning cleanly, not stuck. The fan pattern looked even. He knelt and put 2 fingers into the soil under the wetted edge. Cool, but not cold. Wet deeper than the neighboring row, the way it might be near the end of a long irrigation if the loam had taken water instead of shedding it. The first time he noticed it had been his first spring here, when the block still had younger leaves and he still checked too many things twice. He had thought leak. Then he had thought bad regulator. Then he had thought he had remembered the previous row wrong. By the second summer he knew it was not a leak because leaks traveled. They made a soft mess of one place, or they cut a little creek down the furrow, or they sank a hole where a squirrel had tunneled. This did none of that. It stayed in the same narrow run of rows near the north end and showed itself in the same part of the night, close to dawn, never enough to pull anybody out of bed. He moved to the next tree and checked the sprinkler head, then the next. Same stake spacing, same nozzle color, same pressure-compensating body with dust on the lower lip. On the riser at the row head, the flush cap was dry. He bent and put his palm against the lateral line. It was firm with pressure, no more and no less than the row beside it. He stood and looked down the length of the trees. In March these rows leafed a little earlier than the others. Not enough for a manager in daylight to stop the truck and say so. Enough that Tomas had seen it in the half hour before sunrise, when the orchard was still mostly one color and this stretch had gone a cleaner green first. He finished the pass, circled west, and came back to the headworks where the older irrigator was sitting on an overturned fertilizer bucket beside the valve box, drinking coffee from a steel thermos with the lid off. Gil had been there longer than Tomas had been in California. He said this the way other men said their age, without pride in it and without apology. He worked the permanent ground and came in when a pump seal went bad or a booster station threw an alarm, or somebody needed to know whether a pressure problem was upstream or local. In the winter, he wore the same canvas coat every day until the cuffs shone. "Any leaks?" Gil said. "No." Block 22 had a split spaghetti tube by the fence. "I cut it and put a barb in." Gil nodded once. Steam from the thermos lid touched his face and went away. Tomas stood with one hand on the open valve box lid. The solenoid wires came in from the controller through gray conduit, wire nuts wrapped in old tape. Below them, the hydraulic hum of the open valve made the plastic box tremble faintly against his wrist. "Those north rows in 19, he said. "Same thing again." Gil looked at him over the lid of the thermos. "Which thing?" 88 through 92. Maybe 93. They get ahead. Ahead of what? Tomas moved his hand in a short, uncertain line, meaning the block, the set, the night, all of it. "More water," he said. Gil set the thermos down between his boots. "You got a leak." "No." "Clog somewhere else makes it look that way." "No." Gil smiled a little then, not because it was funny exactly, more because Tomas had answered too fast. "You asked the report in the morning." "I'm asking you now." Gil rubbed a thumb along the seam of the thermos cup. "It runs a little fat before shutoff." "Why?" "Because it does." Tomas waited. Gil looked past him into the trees where the rows had gone back to being only rows. That side used to be a different set. "One. Before you." "Different how?" Gil shrugged inside the coat. "Different enough." That was all he gave. If the reports were clean and the valves opened and closed and the reservoir did not get pulled down too hard before daylight, Gil did not spend his language on the rest. "Should say something?" Tomas asked. Gil picked up the thermos again. "To who?" Tomas looked at the dark shop buildings past the end of the block. "If it bothers you," Gil said, "write the row numbers on the board. And then somebody sees them." He put the thermos cup back on and stood up with a groan that made clear which parts of him were original equipment and which had been repaired. Walk 24 before the dew comes in. Last week the west tail had a clogged nozzle. He left Tomas at the box and went toward the pump road, not hurrying, hands in his coat pockets. Tomas closed the lid and drove east. By 3:30 the air had changed. The heat that had stayed in the lanes after sunset was gone from the surface, and the orchard had started giving back the cold it kept for morning. His sleeves were wet to the forearms from brushing past leaves. On the ATV rack behind him were a coil of half-inch tubing, spare heads, take-apart couplers, 2 stakes, and a crescent wrench that knocked softly against the metal tray when he crossed ruts. He checked block 24, found the clogged nozzle, swapped it, flushed the line until the grit stopped coming, and moved on. At the edge of 17 he shut the engine off and listened to a booster pump cycling somewhere by the reservoir, the motor starting low and catching clean. Coyotes made themselves busy far out toward the canal. A truck passed on the county road without slowing. A barn owl came low down one of the lanes ahead of him, pale once in the dark, and was gone before he had decided what it was. He sat on the ATV with the engine off until the lane was only a lane again. At 4:15 he went back to 19. He told himself he was passing that way anyway, which was almost true. The set was near the end now. He could hear it in the water, the slight lightness that came before shutoff when the night had narrowed and the system was lining its last decisions up. The same rows were dark again before the others. Not by much. The soil took his weight and kept it. He walked to the row head and looked at the riser. Aluminum pipe, faded tag wire, a small manual bleed, regulator body chalked with mineral dust. Nothing on it admitted to anything. He put his hand on the lateral, then on the next one over. Same pressure in his palm, same small vibration from the moving water. Behind him the sprinklers kept up their patient low ticking under the trees. He crouched and pressed the screwdriver into the sole of his boot again, though this time there was no clotted mud yet to remove. Just the damp beginning of it, the place where the tread had started to take the soil in. When the set shut off, it happened all at once. The ticking ceased. Water left the lines with a soft receding hiss. The pressure regulator at the head gave one last throat clear and went still. The silence after irrigation was never complete. Leaves kept moving a little. A truck changed gears on the road. Somewhere another block came on with a far metallic click and began its own faint weather. But this part of the orchard had stopped. Tomas stayed where he was until the eastern edge of the sky changed from black to a color the dirt also knew. In daylight, the row would look almost like the others. The surface would pale. The difference would pull downward where nobody walking through at noon could see it. Men would drive past with clipboards or tablets or coffee, and the block would pass as one block. The trees would take what reached them. He stood, put the screwdriver back in his pocket, and stepped out into the lane. This time the wet soil stayed in the boot tread.